as we expand the teachings or the concepts, we'll see that it's usually, or it's always, our attitude to the flow of life, attitude to pleasure or pain, that turns into guilt, blame, and pride. Which then means it's our attitude to what we could call positive or negative that creates the suffering.
But attitudes are the result of beliefs. If you can let go of the beliefs and embrace everything that comes as part of the human experience and just sit with the uncomfortability, allow guilt to feel guilty, allow pain to feel pain, allow sadness to be sadness, then you're just blending into all of it and accepting it all.
Yes.
There's no more concept of happy, unhappy.
Yes, but yeah, you're right. And effectively, it's what you're expressing is the ultimate, the attitude that is being developed here or spoken about, an attitude of not being attached to either pleasure or pain, an attitude of not feeling that my happiness or who I am is defined by life being pleasure, 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 pleasure. And so even the arising of uncomfortableness, if we discriminate against that, will create suffering inside. So to even see our suffering as part of the flow of life and to not be insistent that it not be there means that we have the attitude that you're talking about. But what are the beliefs that prevent that from happening?
You get hooked onto the beliefs that are generally formed in formative years.
Mm-hmm.
If you hang on to those, then you do stay stuck in attitudes and play them out and see reasons outside of you, cause and effect, instead of seeing the cause within you and the effect playing out outside of you.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can start shedding away those beliefs, then you're left with just the feeling and all of the human feelings.
Yes. So let's expand on the concepts a bit, because I think I can see what you're saying is what needs to happen, but sometimes without a clear explanation of the dynamics, awareness won't know what to land on and won't understand what's what. So the first part that we've been talking about is the sense of personal doership, the idea that I am the doer and the other is the doer. And the reason that we're focusing on that is that we'll find that all of human unhappiness, which what the part you're talking about is attachment to outcomes. Attachment to outcomes and expectation is the expectation that life is a certain way. And with that expectation, we tend to resist pain, resist suffering, and only accept pleasure. So, the first three types of human unhappiness, which are based on the beliefs that are currently in place. The guilt, blame, and pride, based on the idea I am the doer and the other is the doer. The second lot of suffering is this worry and anxiety and attachment to outcomes. So if human suffering is broken into these five categories, let's look at them one at a time and see the basis on which they arise. And the basis on which the first three arise is this belief in personal doership, which says I am a separate independent entity in control of everything I do, and the other is a separate independent entity in control of everything that they do. When we look at what makes a human being the way they are at any point in time, we'll find that the human being is one way at any point in time, which means the way that the human being is going to react to life, including any discrimination or insistence that life is one way or the other, we'll find that the human being is only one way in life, and that way is the way they are based on two factors, their genes and up-to-date conditioning. Two factors that the human being hasn't been in control of for their whole life. Their genetic structure is something that they were born with and didn't choose, and then life impacted them moment after moment after moment, and put in place these beliefs that we're talking about through the events and circumstances that the person found themselves in. So a person was born into a certain family that they didn't choose, went to a certain school, brought up in a certain country, and all of that, plus the events that happen in their life, some traumatic, being attacked by a dog or being teased at school, all of that becomes part of their up-to-date conditioning. And when a human being is put into a circumstance, a reaction happens based on the circumstance at hand and the makeup of the human being in that moment. And a bit like two chemicals coming together, there's a reaction that happens, and that reaction is not something that is optional. The reaction is destined to be that reaction based on the makeup of the two chemicals. They don't stop and have a conference about how they're going to react. It's just a mechanical reaction. And by and large, in fact, I don't even need to use the word by and large, completely, however anyone acts at any point in time in life is a mechanical reaction based on the circumstance at hand and their...
But until they're released, because they come back as patterns throughout our life until we recognize them, sat with them and release them.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
Mm.
So how do they get put in place?
Genetic, inheritance, karma, past lives, and childhood experiences, for sure.
And so they get put in place by life as it unfolds. And how do they get released?
Our perception of the outside, of what's happening outside, that we bring back in as feelings and torsions, contractions, they're released by acknowledging them and sitting with them and releasing, feeling, allowing the feeling to be, but without the story attached.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you see, I'm not disagreeing what you're saying, but if we expand on the concepts here, what we'll find is that it will provide an explanation of the mechanics that you're speaking about in a way that explains the process. So the releasing, as far as I see, is that life conditions us a certain way and the beliefs are put in place. And the undoing of the beliefs is exactly the same process, same principle. It's life that reconditions us in order for the beliefs to change. So this is not generally something that we recognize about the physical aspect and the psychological and emotional aspects of the human being, where often our experience of what we are is we are the thinking and the moving, we are this is who I am, and I am the one in control of that.
I don't think we have control over anything.
Mm.
And I think that to undo them, it's got to be undone at a subconscious level. So any theories about how to undo them are just absolutely a waste of time.
Yeah. So if we were telling someone to go and undo them, we'd be talking about personal doership. We'd be talking about a process that you as an individual need to go and do, and that's just not how it works, as you say. So how it works is that life puts in place the error, and then at some point life starts undoing the error. And how does life undo the error? It undoes the error by creating new conditioning that undoes the existing conditioning that is problematic. And being in situations like this, or reading certain books, contemplating, is all part of the way life brings in new conditioning that starts to demonstrate that the existing conditioning may not be as accurate as it's held. And as some of the beliefs that are in place are seen to be inaccurate for the first time often, because beliefs are held in place because it's assumed that they are true. That's what keeps a belief in place. So if life brings about new conditioning that points out to the fallacy of the belief, and that's seen, then what tends to happen is that belief falls away. Not my doing, even though the thinking appears to be my thinking, the thinking is actually a result of one's genes and up-to-date conditioning.
But what seems to fall away, there's still a feeling, there's still an emotion attached to it, and that also needs to be released or experienced. It can't be just released at a mental level.
Sure.
So the burning away of that feeling is also really called for.
Which is also not our doing, but part of the process. So the release of the deeply ingrained beliefs, which often are contained in emotion that was stored away from past experience, that's a continuation of the process, a process that starts off as an intellectual understanding. The intellectual understanding directs awareness to the mechanics that are in place, mainly the mechanics of the belief. The belief is seen to be not as valid as we've held it in the past, which then unlocks the system. The belief, in a way, tends to keep the energy contained. As the belief opens up, then the energy is allowed to be felt. And it's never anything we do, but a process that unfolds quite magically.
Rather a case of surrendering completely.
And even the surrender is not our doing, it's a realization that for my whole life I have been trying to make things happen. And the very act of trying to make things happen is a feeding of this sense of the very entity that has at the root of my suffering. So surrender is a realization that every time I try to run the show because I think that's good for me, it's actually quite the opposite. Yeah. So, if this is about reconditioning and the falling away of beliefs, I feel it's very important to speak about what structures, what mechanics tend to be in place that support the beliefs. And then that can allow awareness to start landing on these mechanics. So, I'll go back a little bit. What are we really looking for in life, in practical terms? We're looking for peace of mind. And maybe this is what I left out, which I was getting to. What is peace of mind? We're not sure. We look at what our unhappiness is. And we see that our unhappiness is guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, what I'm calling suffering. And then we can realize, wow, my unhappiness is suffering. So my happiness, which is peace of mind, is simply the end of suffering. So peace of mind turns out to be not the gaining of anything, but the end of a load of guilt and blame that has been carried around for our whole life. And so if we come to the conclusion that peace of mind is the end of suffering, then it's worth looking at or understanding what suffering is in its totality and understanding the belief systems on which that suffering arises. So the first half of suffering, guilt, blame, and pride, the basis of which is this belief, I am the doer and the other is the doer. If the belief is in place, when the other hurts me, delivers pain, which I believe is an attack on who I am, I have to blame them. You hurt me, so I hate you. It's not optional. So if someone is saying, I'm going to try and accept, that's what I can see that my non-acceptance is the issue. So I'm going to try and accept.
I was going to say, nobody can hurt you. You allow yourself to hurt yourself based on your beliefs, based on your experiences. Mm-hmm. It's your perception of what the person has said or done that's affecting you. It's not the other person per se.
Yeah, but what you're sharing is insight, right? What our suffering comes from is a lack of insight. So the fact is that when suffering is there, it's the suffering is there because of our relationship to what the other has done. And so it's great to see that the movement that is happening is wrong. It's that the other can never actually hurt me. That my suffering is not actually what the other does to me, but my attitude to what has happened. And then we find that it's my attitude to what has happened that creates the feeling inside, which turns out to be our suffering. And so in this case, we're talking about blame. The other does something that we perceive as an attack on who we are. The other functions in such a way that delivers pain to me. And because we have this belief that what I am is the doer and what I need in order to be happy is pleasure, 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 pleasure. That's the ingrained belief that's in place when suffering is prevalent in our life. And that ingrained belief that I need pleasure in order to be complete sees the other as the one that delivers or takes away my happiness. So if the other does something that delivers pain, our attitude to that is, you have attacked me, you have taken away what I need in order to be complete, and so I hate you. If, on the other hand, we start to see that myself and the other are not the doers, we might start to be able to relate to the flow of life as a happening, a story, a creation, and that when the other hurts me, it's my destiny for pain to be included in this moment, and their destiny to be the one that delivers the pain. This realization on the basis that anything that happens through me is always a functioning of consciousness, that whatever I do is consciousness functioning through me, therefore whatever the other does is consciousness functioning through them. So with this understanding of what we are, the separation that comes with the idea that I am the doer and the other is the doer, that separation tends to fall away, and we no longer see each other as enemies and competitors, but rather brothers and sisters in a game of life. And the key is twofold. One, the falling away of the sense of personal doership, the belief in personal doership, and more importantly, the falling away of the belief that my happiness is dependent on circumstance, my happiness is dependent on pleasure. So how do we see that we're not the doers? The explanation is that a human being in any moment is forced to act exactly the way they act in each moment, based on two factors they haven't been in control of: their genes and up-to-date conditioning. There's only one way the person can act, given the circumstance they find themselves in. It's not personal. It's a biological or psychological reaction in the moment. The second aspect is this attachment to outcomes. For our whole life, we've been seeking happiness through pleasure, and we've had enough experience in life for us to take note of that experience and say, for my whole life I've been following this formula. Happiness in the flow of life, or happiness through pleasure in the flow of life. And each time I get happiness, it's pleasure. So each time I get pleasure in the flow of life, it's pleasurable for a very limited amount of time. And then another objective is set. So the happiness or the pleasure that I get in the flow of life is never going to give me continuous, unbroken happiness. We've got much experience in the past that shows us that. And we can take this concept, if the experience in the past is not enough, take the concept and apply it to the pleasure we get in the flow of life from now onwards. And we'll find that pleasure is never fully satisfying. And so for me, there was a very significant event that happened that demonstrated this. I had set a financial goal that I expected to take about 2 years to achieve, and through very good luck, an investment performed particularly well, and the financial goal was achieved not by my doing, but by sheer luck in the course of a month. And for about a day, maybe that's even an exaggeration, I was very excited. And promptly, a new objective was set in place, a new financial goal. So this one I expected to take 2 years to achieve. It was achieved, or it happened, in the space of about a month. And promptly I set another goal, and there was this realization, really, is this how I'm going to live my life? Achieving something and promptly setting another goal? Because when I set the first goal, I was quite convinced, when this happens, everything will be okay. That's generally the idea we have when we set a strong objective in place. When that happens, everything will be okay. And strangely enough, we get it and we find the feeling inside is that, well, maybe the next goal will be the one that makes everything okay. This is particularly relevant for relationships also. When I find a lover, then everything is going to be okay. And invariably, we get that from time to time, and we know from our own experience, it doesn't create continuous unbroken happiness. Sometimes it creates quite the opposite. So, the consciousness at rest, source at rest, the unmanifest, at some point explodes into manifestation. Consciousness at rest is prior to the manifestation, meaning prior to time and space and this daily life experience. And because it's absolute creative potentiality, at some point it has to explode into creation, into manifestation. And so this experience of life from the beginning of time to the end of time is consciousness at rest exploding into movement, consciousness in movement. So from the beginning of time to the end of time, the notion put forward here is that life is a story created by Source, unfolding in each moment exactly as it's destined to unfold. That what you and I and everyone else is intrinsically a connected part of the story. That we are not independent entities in control of what is going on. We are destined to act exactly as the story dictates that we will act, in order for the story to unfold exactly the way it's been created. Ramesh used to say, the story is in the can. It has been written, directed, and produced, and now we're watching it unfold. And we're intrinsically characters within the story. So on that notion, everything that happens is predetermined from the point of view of the human. And if we don't like the esoteric explanation that consciousness at rest has become consciousness in movement, and whatever happens in any moment is part of the story of life that we didn't create, then we can look at the more causal explanation that whatever anyone does in each moment is based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning, which obviously is part of the story if we look at it that way. But if we don't want to see it as a creation, we can just say that it's accidental, and whatever happens is through each human being, part of the genes and up-to-date conditioning, which couldn't have been any other way, which means the action of the human being had to be the way it is. A recognition of this, from whichever angle you want to look at it, starts to undermine the ingrained belief inside of us that I am the doer and the other is the doer. And if that ingrained belief, I am the doer and the other is the doer, starts to get weakened, then the flowers of that belief, the flower of guilt, blame and pride, will start to diminish. And if the belief is completely eroded, then the possibility of guilt, blame and pride arising can't happen.
So could you then address the topic of free will? Because I can see there's thinking happening, and there's negative thinking, and then there's a feeling of I have to do something about these thoughts, and I have to think positively, or I have to not just let these patterns run its course because it's destructive. And then there's the feeling of I have to do something with this. Could you address that?
Yep. So if we look at thinking, the assumption is there is a thinker. And so if we assume that if there is thinking, there has to be a thinker, then I am the thinker gets put in place, this entity that is the thinker. If we recognize that thinking just happens, from two different perspectives we can look at this. Either thinking arises out of nothing, appears in consciousness out of nothing, and then subsides back into nothing. And we look for a thinker and we can't find one. That the thought just arose, and the thought arose out of nowhere. Or, if we want to look at the more causal explanation, we'll see that we saw something, heard something, tasted, touched, smelt something in the circumstance, and a thought arose based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning, the genes and up-to-date conditioning of the brain, essentially, which is part of the body. And so when something is seen, smelt, tasted, touched, or heard, something that we're not in control of in the environment, and a thought arises, we can see that this thought is not personal, but a result of these factors that weren't in our control. And what follows from a thought is an action. So if the thought was destined to be there based on the circumstance and the way that the brain is designed to act when it sees that circumstance, then the action that follows is an extension of that. Not your doing, but a happening. And so in this case, you're talking about negative thinking. So negative thinking is coming out of this machine, the brain, that has been designed to produce negative thinking. And a thought that says, I have to do something about the negative thinking, is a thought that doesn't recognize what negative thinking actually is. Negative thinking is a product of the brain and not your doing. And so the idea that I need to do something about it is another thought produced by the brain. So at this point, it's worth bringing in the notion of the thinking mind and the working mind. And the thinking mind is that part of the brain that is convinced that it is the doer. And the working mind is the part of the brain that is functional and recognizes that everything is a happening, including whatever comes out of the brain. And so if the thought, I need to do something about this, comes up, and then it turns into guilt because the outcome is unsuccessful, that's a form of suffering that we're talking about. And to the extent that we then start to feel guilty about that, it's another thought that is judging the fact that we haven't been able to stop the thinking and judging the guilt that comes from that. So to recognize this as our suffering doesn't mean we're trying to change it. It just means that we're starting to recognize that the negative thinking is a happening. The judging the negative thinking is a happening based on a misunderstanding of who is producing the negative thinking. So this just means that awareness can start to land on functions that are happening automatically and start to see them as automatic happenings. And then we can find, if that happens, there's more space that arises, a space to witness without taking it personally. And that space tends to allow us to see experientially the automatic functioning of thinking, which means the understanding that thinking is a happening and not my doing goes deeper. And as that understanding goes deeper and deeper, the witnessing becomes stronger and stronger. Because effectively, the understanding that thinking happens, that actions happen, is eroding the belief I am the doer. And as the belief I am the doer is eroded, the automatic function of trying to control life, trying to change life at all costs, starts to fall away.
So then what do I do, so to say, when I'm stuck in it, in a way? When I'm just gone down the spiral and I'm on the bottom of the pit and I can't get out, in a way?
So the main theme we're following at the moment is that life is a happening, not my doing. That the story of life will unfold in each moment exactly the way it's destined to unfold. And clearly suffering is a very valid and significant part of the content of the story of life. And sure, there are going to be times when suffering is there and it's not destined for that suffering to end, destined for the suffering to be intense. And if the suffering is intense and we don't see it as a happening, which is usually what intense suffering includes, from an outside perspective, I see that as destiny. Nothing that anyone can do about it until such time as something happens that changes it. If we, on the other hand, see that, because our up-to-date conditioning has changed, we have started to witness thinking happening, suffering happening, not my doing. If we start to see that suffering is there and there's nothing I can do about it, then there's an acceptance of suffering as a happening and not my doing. And that acceptance creates some space. And the more and more space that is created, the less and less involvement in suffering tends to be the most efficient way that life brings about change. So the answer to the question is sometimes it's just destined for suffering to be there. And the question, what can I do to end the suffering, is once again coming from the very understandable desire for suffering to end, but it's coming from the belief I am the doer and I can control what the experience of life will look like.
Yeah, and when I'm there, I see it's the sense of free will. So I have this thought that I can actually do something, because I can choose to, like, okay, will I now engage in something that will make the suffering stop, in a way? So I have the illusion of free choice, and then, yeah. Do you see where I'm getting at?
Yeah, and that's our birthright in any moment, to do exactly what we feel like doing, knowing that the outcome of what we choose to do in each moment is not in our control. So in the moment when there is suffering, you have complete free will to do whatever you think you can or should do in order to bring the suffering to an end. Hopefully we recognize that our free will is just a feeling of free will, and that what actions follow, because we choose to do them, is actually not our choosing but a happening, and that the outcome is not in our control. So exercise your free will to do whatever you think is going to be best, knowing that the outcome is not in your control. This might sound like a very unfortunate situation to find ourselves in, but really seeing the mechanics of life as they really are is not as disastrous as it might seem. So if we start to see life as it really is, it might mean that we start to understand ourselves as we really are. And the reason that continuous unbroken peace of mind, which is the complete absence of suffering, is available, is for one reason alone, and that is because of what the essence of the human happens to be. The essence of the human is something that is incapable of suffering. And why suffering happens is because we don't know ourselves. So to come to know life as it is means that there's a subsequent effect, which is we come to know ourselves as we really are. And suffering tends to arise because of circumstance in the flow of life. What we truly are is unaffected by the flow of life, unaffected by circumstance. So to come to know that, to be that, means that the potential for suffering to stop really starts to be there.
So there's a favorite place I get repetitively, do I have to turn on? That I get repetitively hooked on. Maybe, I don't know. So it's when my son gets into a real suffering loop, and I know that's not his doing, and I know there's nothing I can do, but I don't want him to be in a suffering loop. So I notice, okay, I don't want what's happening. And awareness has no trouble landing on that. And then it repeats. So it's just going to repeat until it quits repeating?
Well, not exactly well, yes, it will repeat till it stops repeating. That's true, but how does it stop repeating? And life is a story of time and space. It's been created to be a story that unfolds as if cause and effect is the reasoning for things. Mm-hmm. So we can come to see that actually life is a spontaneous creation that arises moment after moment, and cause and effect is not the ultimate mechanism. But in practice, cause and effect is the mechanism that life puts in place. And so the story as we watch it unfold is a story of cause and effect, which means food doesn't just magically appear on my table as a spontaneous arising. Food arises on my table after I place an order with the waiter. Mm. And so in this story of life, life brings about change through a process of cause and effect. And the process, the cause that brings about an effect is this reconditioning. Mm. And in particular here, the notion that we are convinced that our happiness, meaning our completeness, meaning who I am, we're convinced that that is to be found in pleasure and pain. Mm-hmm. And so at this point it's worth noting that the flow of life as it unfolds moment after moment is only ever either pleasure or pain. Whatever is happening is either pleasurable or painful. Mm-hmm. And if we can start to recognize that that's the case and hold in, and our up-to-date conditioning includes the concept, I'm convinced that my happiness is to be found in pleasure and pain, then we can start seeing the dynamic for what it is, so the dynamic you just explained. So let's look at what pleasure is. Pleasure is those circumstances in life that are in line with your biological preferences. Mm-hmm. Your biological preferences are part of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So who you are in this moment. So whatever is in line with your biological preference is going to be experienced as pleasure, and whatever is out of line of your biological preference is going to be considered pain. Mm-hmm. So seeing your son suffer is not in line with your biological preference. It's pain. And the reason that there's suffering that comes from that is because the belief inside that who I am is effective, defined by there being pleasure, 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 pleasure. Mm-hmm. And this is not a conscious thing. This is something that just happens. But that's the basis on which it happens. Mm-hmm. That when you see your son, someone you love, in pain or suffering, which is painful to you, then there is a resistance to that pain, because the pain is seen to be an attack on who you are. So if we drop into being, if that becomes something that is available to us, we can experientially start to understand that what I am in essence is unaffected by the flow of life. So if we've found that this field of being is something that we've started to be able to access and drop into, we'll notice that in the midst of suffering, which is an attachment to outcomes, attachment to life being a certain way, if thinking stops and we drop into being, the circumstance remains largely the same. And yet, our relationship to the circumstance changes significantly, meaning our attitude to circumstance is now no longer one of attachment to circumstance. So pain will be there, and yet from a place of being, it's known directly that that doesn't touch who I am.
Yeah.
And so what this means is what I started mentioning.
It can hurt my heart even if at the same time.
Yes, absolutely. So this is not a way
Does
of...
it not hurt my heart?
Absolutely not. These things are very sad. And sadness is pain. So this is not about coming up with some magical solution to bring about the end of pain in life. Pain in life is always going to be an intrinsic part of the flow of life. Pain sometimes, pleasure at other times. So seeing someone we love hurting is going to be pain. It's going to be sadness. The thing that shifts is our attitude and our relationship to pleasure and pain. Which means that if the belief, the deeply ingrained belief that my completeness is dependent on life looking a certain way, including anyone I like, love, not being in pain, if that belief is there, then there has to be suffering arise along with the pain. But if that belief falls away, then pain will be there and suffering will not accompany it.
I see, yeah.
So what we tend to experience is a combination of pain and the accompanying suffering. And when the beliefs about who we are that are inaccurate fall away, what's left is the pain or pleasure in the flow of life, but without an attachment to it. So I would suggest that this notion, it starts off as an intellectual understanding. It's a concept that's put forward that says, my happiness, my completeness is never to be found in the flow of life. My completeness is never to be found in circumstance. So that's a concept that we have to explore and verify for ourselves.
But I had the idea, like when I drop into being, there's silence when that's happening, but there's still pain. I had the idea that if there was still pain, that it shouldn't be there.
The pain shouldn't be there.
Yeah, there was something wrong, or I don't know.
But
now when you say that, it's like, okay, yeah, it has a place.
Sure. As in something wrong with your enlightenment, let's say?
Or something wrong maybe that I had an idea pain disappears. That's what I mean. You know, like it was a misplaced idea.
Yeah, great.
Now when you just said that, it was misplaced idea. But they're strong when we have misplaced ideas.
And to me, frankly, when they fall away, it's one of the greatest gifts. Because it's only those ideas, those beliefs that are misplaced that get in the way.
I don't know what I expected, that he could be in complete pain and I would just like sit here totally content. I think that's what I expected. You can expect that you can sit here at peace. Yeah.
But it will be at peace with your pain.
Yeah.
And then that means at peace with the fact that his destiny is for there to be suffering, not his doing, not your doing.
Good. Good.
So this creation is a creation of duality on the surface, which means duality means pleasure and pain, good and bad, big and small, hot and cold, wealth and disease, health and poverty, health and disease, wealth and poverty. And so sometimes we look at the flow of life and we want it to be just health and just wealth and just good and just the perfect temperature water. And that's not what this story is about. So that can sometimes help the question that we have, why? Why is there poverty in the world? And because we're attached to outcomes where we believe that my completeness is to be found in pleasure, 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 all our energy goes to try and solve the world's poverty problems, which is not something we're capable of doing. So to find out that our happiness is actually not to be found in the flow of life, not requiring life to be a certain way, means that all the efforts that are being put into trying to control my life situation can fall away, or at least become very practical. So the suggestion is, in each moment, do what you can. So if you can feed someone that's hungry and you feel like it, feed them. That's a practical solution to poverty in the moment. And if you don't feel like feeding someone who's hungry, you walk past, they ask for some money, and you don't give it to them, then it's important to see that either giving them money or not giving them money is a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. And then the judgment of yourself can start to fall away. And what happens in the next moment, maybe you come across a beggar in the next day, and that day you find yourself giving them some money. Or you find yourself not giving them money and feeling guilty, and that becomes part of your up-to-date conditioning. And so then you decide, I'm going to take some 10 rupee notes out when I go, so it's easy for me to give them some money. And that giving them money is because of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, which was affected by the circumstance you found yourself in previously, where you didn't give the money and then you felt guilty, and then the thinking came up with a solution. I'll take 10 rupee notes out with me and I'll drop it in their bowl. But it's not saying that's what we should do. Yeah. It's just saying if it happens, it's going to be a happening according to everything that came before. So your suffering when your son is in pain is also a happening, not your doing. And if you find yourself stuck in it, it means we can objectively understand what it is. If the concepts have started to sink in, we can see suffering, and the thought might arise, this suffering is based on an attachment to pleasure and pain. My son's suffering is pain to me, and my suffering is my attitude to the pain that I'm experiencing. And so if suffering is there, we go, that's why it's happening. And if it's happening, it means that the way we are in that moment forces it to happen. So it's not about trying to fix it now. That's why trying to do spiritual inquiry and solutions when we're in deep suffering tends to be pointless to a large extent. The inquiry is best done when we're feeling good. So it's important for this curiosity and this interest to flower in such a way that we start to observe life when there's space, when we're not suffering. And as we observe life when there's space, the understanding starts to go deeper and deeper, and that's when it has a chance to actually cut off the suffering when suffering happens. If we try to, it's a bit like studying for an exam 2 minutes before the exam starts, or while the exam is started and you're not allowed to study. So if we have that strategy, it's not going to be a very good strategy. So the spiritual inquiry is best done when there's space.
This was interesting because I had a question taking shape, and now it will be a contradiction to what you just said. So, but I was setting my question was before that, so it's not. Anyway, I would like to describe it in 3 levels. When Øystein was talking about having dark thought, let's call it, suffering. And one answer is that's your destiny, and it's not nothing. There is no doer, so that kind of thing. But I would say also one way to answering is to say, at that point you have the illusion of being the doer.
Mm-hmm.
So this imagined doer can ask the question, like in the way I understand Ramana's teachings, these thoughts, to who does it come? And then there's a spontaneous answer, it's me, to me, of course, who else? And then, who am I? And I tried that, and it didn't work for a while, but after a while it started to work and created some distance to this, and I thought it was actually helping this imagine, so long as there is this dark thoughts and somebody who believes in them, that somebody can also do that, and that will weaken. That's the level 2.
Okay, but let me just address it, because I think this is very good, because you're right. But that thought is not the doer. Well, it can be if the doer does it. That's one thing. But what you're describing, asking the question, who does this suffering happen to, for example, that's a happening, right? And so we're not saying here that happenings won't happen. In fact, we're saying that based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning, everything will happen according to that. So your genes and up-to-date conditioning include concepts put forward by Ramana, a self-inquiry. And so self-inquiry is happening. So if you can see that self-inquiry happening is not your doing, then there's a real space for self-inquiry to continue to happen automatically. So you're not doing self-inquiry, but self-inquiry is happening. And it's happening as a result of suffering arising. And then when suffering arising, the wisdom concepts are creating the thought, or the wisdom conditioning is kicking into action. No doer, it's a happening. And so it can cut off the suffering. In the same way, these concepts provide a different thought that will arise. The thought is, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life, for example, which can cut off the suffering that is saying this needed to happen and it's a disaster, which we then awareness can land on that as suffering. And the thought can arise, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life, which can cut off the thinking, which means cutting off the suffering.
Yeah, but still it was another answer to the question, and it makes the seeming doer have something that it might seem to do. Mm-hmm. And I believe in my own case that is part of the mechanism that has been dissolving this sense of doership.
Yeah.
So this was the second level. You have something you can...
But I don't want to leave it, because I think that can keep happening. So this is not saying stop doing it, right? It's actually saying that is exactly the process that happens. But you start off seeing it as what you are doing as the doer, and it helps. I'm suggesting that it's not even the doer doing it, it's automatically arising. And so if you come to see that as an automatic happening, then you'll find that the self-inquiry has even more power, much more power, when you can see all of this movement, the suffering, and then the solution to the suffering as a happening, not your doing, which still means that in each moment it feels like you are doing it. It feels like you are asking the question, who am I? So this isn't taking away from what you're saying, that it feels like you can do something, but recognize that what is feeling like you're doing is actually a happening. It really becomes significantly more powerful, and the fact that it's already working for you means that it's pretty much happening as an automatic happening. So, sorry, carry on to the...
Yeah, well, and then the third level was what I took you to be saying, that I might go a step further. Let's see, I find myself awake, because the way I understand what he was saying, that is the moment when he has realized that he's inside something. So that is already something. Before that, there was just suffering, perhaps. And then you can go, I think, would say, another level, namely, what I took her to be saying is that, oh yeah, this happens a lot to me, that now I'm inventing things. Each time I see a dog, I go into this, whatever, and feeling bad thoughts about how animal was treated, or whatever. Maybe I should create a particular practice to really, because he was talking about the emotional, it's not just a thought, it's emotional, and the way I understand it is that then you can see you have patterns with strong power in them, and then you might actually create or ask for help somewhere and get into so now I will spend 15 minutes each day to do this kind of thing. So then we have seemingly then the seeming doer again having something to do with this, and ultimately there is no doer, but I'm talking about way of describing this process now. So the first level, it's my destiny to suffer, okay? And the second, who is the sufferer? And the third, oh, I'm suffering in one particular way. Let's design a special method to relieve this. So that's the...
And so, but okay,
the
but
third level.
this is, so because I'm not disagreeing with what's said, it's very good, but if we look at what those methods are doing, we don't realize it. But what all of those methods are doing is realizing I'm not the doer, and my happiness isn't to be found in pleasure or pain. So what was suggested in the first place there is to say the problem is when I discriminate between happiness and unhappiness. Right? If I discriminate against I'm attached to happiness and pushing away unhappiness. And so I agree that exactly, but we need a principle on which, if we see the principle, and the principle is that there is an attachment to pleasure or pain. And we see that that is my problem. That is my suffering. My suffering is about attaching to one and pushing away the other. So when we see that, the practice then and the understanding is, oh, real happiness is when I allow both to be there. Right? And whatever practice that deals with another problem will either be a practice of allowing things to be as they are, meaning realizing what I am is not affected by the flow of life, the pleasure and pain aspect. So it creates a stepping back. Or it is a practice that somehow is undermining the personal doership aspect. And so in this particular teaching, the focus is on the root and making it very clear that the root of all suffering is the belief that we are the doer. So if we go up a level, like you said, and say, here's what you can do, and there's plenty of teachings that focus on that, then that's very valid, because to go right to the root and see there is no doer is not necessarily something that everyone is ready to do, or it's not something that's ready to happen for everyone. So in some teachings they will give the doer techniques. Here we're pointing at the ultimate problem. So techniques can reinforce the doership. So meditation, if the doer hears that you have to meditate, for a while meditation becomes a rigid practice, and it's the furthest thing away from meditation. But in time, as meditation starts to work, and it usually changes when the practicer of meditation realizes that their attitude to meditation, where they have to achieve something, where they, the doer, have to stop the thinking, where they, the doer, have to become a great meditator that sits for 2 hours a day between 5 in the morning and 7 in the morning, when they realize, actually, this is more of the stuff that I'm actually trying to meditate to get away from. So that realization then means the meditation starts to become a happening rather than a doing. So there's a lot of value in what you're sharing, because this is what happens. Something does happen. It's not about we throw our hands up in despair and that's it. What tends to happen in this exposure to this set of concepts is a whole lot of thoughts that arise that see what is happening in an accurate light. So that means that if there is suffering, the thought will arise that says, suffering is present, that I'm aware of. Suffering is an uncomfortableness with oneself. Yes, that's true. Suffering is based on the belief, I am the doer. And it will investigate that. So it's not that nothing happens. A process definitely happens, a process of awareness and contemplation. But that process, to me, is very important to see that that process is not anyone's doing, but a continuation of the person's genes and up-to-date conditioning. And it has a significant effect. And so if the conditioning is Ramana's who am I, that's fantastic, because who am I is the answer to, or there's only one problem in life for the human being. Not two, one problem for the human being in life. And that is not knowing themselves. What gets in the way of us knowing ourselves is this false idea of ourselves as the doer and someone that needs this, that and the other in order to be complete. And so the question, who am I, answers that one problem. The problem is not knowing oneself. So it makes sense. Who am I is the ultimate question that needs a true answer.
So I'm on a bit of a sales campaign of this. I just want to end to say that I have experience when, starting from a situation, the way I interpreted what Øystein said, you find yourself in something, and that is in the beginning that I get some distance by finding that, and then I do this. To whom is this coming? It's to me, and who am I? And then that actually changes things to this imagined doer, or in this case sufferer, becomes like an object thought, and something is watching that. Mm-hmm. And so then I see, I had this example, silly perhaps, about the dog then. So there's something is suffering from thinking about dogs and troubles, and then there is something watching the sufferer from thinking about dogs and the dog problem. So the subject and object becomes two objects. Mm-hmm. There's an unsuffering witness to this. Mm-hmm. So that it has really worked quite well this. So that's given me structure to do this process that you're talking about, I think. So.
And so what you've described is the process of bringing about witnessing. So once, and that's ultimately what needs to happen. Our suffering needs to be witnessed. Our pleasure and pain needs to be witnessed. The thinking needs to be witnessed. And so turning these things that are objects and making them clearly seen as objects is a methodology that can allow witnessing to happen. And so this is not trying to say you have to do it this way, right? Because however witnessing happens, it's a win. That's the objective. But when witnessing happens, it's because an object that previously hasn't been seen at a distance as an object. When witnessing happens, it's when an object that previously hasn't been seen as an object becomes seen as an object. So all of these things are not what we are. Suffering is not what we are. Thinking is not what we are. The body's movement is not what we are. So turning it into, explaining it as a happening according to a biological movement based on one's genes and up-to-date conditioning means that awareness can start to witness all of that. So who am I is very, very valid if it creates witnessing. Some people have gone around saying, who am I, who am I, who am I, who am I, and it does nothing. Because the purpose of the technique isn't really understood there. But when it arises in the way you described it, then it's doing its job. So let's talk about another complementary to that. So Ramana suggests, who am I? And Nisargadatta suggests, abide in I am. And the question, who am I, doesn't have an answer that we can write down or speak about. The question, who am I, is not a question that is meant to be answered intellectually. And Nisargadatta doesn't suggest that we ask, who am I? He just suggests that we abide in I am. And the great thing is that if you put these two together, you find that Nisargadatta's suggestion is the answer to Brahmana's suggestion. Who am I? And the answer is found when we abide in I am. Not as an intellectual answer, but as a being. The answer then is known because we are it. So how do we practice this abiding in I am? And the practice of abiding I am is something that happens. This is not an instruction of something to do, but a description of something that might happen. And how it would happen if it happens is because the up-to-date conditioning is kicking in. So the suggestion is when awareness lands on suffering of any sort, and there is awareness, this is suffering, this is my unhappiness, and we realize that it's based on an attachment to outcomes or guilt, blame, doership for what we have done or what the other has done. So regret in the past, expectation in the future. And clearly now we have come to see this does not deliver the answers that I think it's going to deliver. This thinking is not helping me. I've spent my whole life believing that this thinking is beneficial. That's why it keeps happening. I've spent my whole life thinking that regret about the past is actually serving a purpose. That's why it keeps happening. I think that thinking about the future is going to give me what I need, that I can control the future. The more I think about it, the more I'll be able to make it happen. And at some point we realize, no, this is my suffering. This is not helpful. And so all of that understanding I just described there can be packaged in the thought, I am. So when awareness lands on the suffering, the thought, I am, can pop up with all of the understanding I just mentioned and cut off the thinking. Become the bookend to the obsessive thinking that may have been happening for hours or days or months. And in that moment when the I am thought arises and cuts off the thinking, we have the potential, there is the potential to drop into being. And that being is in a field that is outside of thinking. It's somewhere that's accessed when the center of consciousness drops into the body, out of the head, which is where being is never going to be found. If simultaneous to this thought I am, our gaze tends to become quite open and soft, allowing everything to arise and fall as it does in the moment, without focusing on anything in particular, understanding that I don't need life to be a particular way. So that movement of dropping into the chest, into the heart, and opening our gaze simultaneously to the thought I am, which acts as a bookend to the obsessive thinking, allows us potentially to drop into being. A place where we know directly that what we are is complete right now. We might find we only stay there for half a second before the habit and getting dragged out back into thinking happens. And it might be 10 minutes where thinking continues obsessively before there's a realization, wow, how long did I stay in being? I don't even remember being there. And that's okay, because the thought I am can pop up again and create the same dropping back into being. And once again, we might be there for half a second before we're dragged up into thinking again. And then awareness lands on the fact we're back in thinking and I am, and we just drop back. And this is something that can continue to happen while we're moving through life. It's not something that we have to stop and sit quietly to do. And as that movement from the head to the heart happens more and more regularly, as that space of being is recognized to be there all the time, right here and right now, I don't need to go anywhere in order to access it. Then we find that we might rest in being for longer than half a second. Maybe 30 seconds. If we sit there for 30 seconds, not doing anything, just realizing that that is our home, there's an amazing amount of new information about a field that we had no idea actually existed. That can then become part of our experience, that becomes part of our understanding about everything that's being pointed at here. We have a false idea of who we are. A false idea based on the idea I am the doer, the other is the doer, and that my happiness is to be found in the flow of life. And while that idea is functioning, we remain disconnected from what we truly are.
Is there a progression? Let's say I want to learn tennis. So then I'm trying tennis, I'm doing tennis, I'm watching how I hit the ball, I'm getting feedback. And then when I'm really, really good, it's clear that I'm not doing tennis. But in the beginning, when I was learning tennis, and I was paying attention, and it feels like I'm doing tennis.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk about that? There's that change that happens.
Yeah. So the progression is this coming to know ourselves, and it takes effort sometimes it feels like effort, like I'm doing this. I'm doing the inquiry, I'm doing the investigating, I'm doing the dropping into being. And it's just the breaking of the other habit, or the presence of the other habit, that creates the impression that I need to get better at this. And as the other habit that takes us out of being falls away, we find that being is actually where we reside. And it's completely natural, and it's not something that we have to work at anymore. It means that we can walk through life, allowing life to unfold exactly as it unfolds, without having to try not to react, try to accept. We just find that acceptance is our natural state. Acceptance is our true nature. Happiness is our true nature, because happiness is actually the absence of non-acceptance. So our true nature is peace, and it's not a true nature that we have to keep, or a function that we have to keep doing in daily life. If we had to keep doing peace,
We just notice it happening.
it would be hard work.
Yeah. Okay.
But this process of investigating the mechanics, that is a process that at first seems like I am doing it. I, the doer, am investigating. At some point it becomes amazingly clear, wow, I'm not doing investigation, investigation is happening. And that shifts the investigation to a whole new level of efficacy. Hugely so. It becomes exponentially more powerful when a witnessing of investigation happens. So the investigation continues, and yet what we are is witnessing the investigation happening, witnessing the practicing happening. And eventually, like you say, you realize that tennis is your second nature, and in this case it's our first nature. So we don't need to do anything. So what is the human being when we come to see ourselves clearly? So there's a point where we see the nature of life as an experience, and that there is really no one, because the experience is continually changing, and what I am, or what I thought I was, is always changing. And so when we try to find the doer, or the person for that matter, we find there is no one, because nothing is ever the same. It's always changing. So as soon as I say this is what I am, I found it's never been there, because it's always changing. And that is a realization of the fundamental nature of experience. And in that we'll find, oh, there is something that is ever present, that in order for experience to be an experience, there has to be awareness of the experience. You can't have experience, even the changing experience. You can't have a changing experience or a static experience if there isn't awareness of the experience. And so we realize, awareness is the background that is constant and unchanging, and the content, which is what I thought I was, is just an object in the content. The body is just an object in the content. The awareness is that which is ever present, and everything arises and falls inside awareness. And we find there's another aspect of awareness that is also ever present, and that's the sense of existence, being. So we come to see the only truth in the manifestation, the only thing that remains constant in the manifestation, is awareness and the impersonal sense of existence. But that's a realization of the nature of experience. It's not how we live life. So we live life having realized that as the human being, knowing that really all there is consciousness. Consciousness being a label for awareness and the sense of existence. But knowing all there is consciousness, the story of life is still a story of Roger living his life and Jessie living her life. And so when we come back and say, this is the experience, even with the realization that experience is transitory and not what I thought it was, I still have to live my life as Roger. So what is Roger? And the perspective now is very different. Previously I thought Roger was this physical, three-dimensional object that was separate from everything, and that if I recognized the consciousness in Roger, it was very clearly, or it was assumed that the consciousness was of the body. So previously, I am this separate entity and everything is coming from that entity, the body. The new perspective, when that falls away, is a realization, what Roger is a combination of impersonal consciousness of source. So awareness and the sense of existence that has linked to a particular body-mind organism, which is a vehicle essentially, a vehicle for consciousness to function through. And the point where consciousness of source connects to the body is the heart, the spiritual heart. And at that point, the sense of I am arises. And then functions through the body as personal consciousness, being Roger's consciousness, which is very much personalized by the characteristics of the body. And so the experience is that Roger lives his life as this individual, doing in each moment whatever he thinks he should do, which is the feeling of free will, with the understanding that when we investigate the free will more closely, we find that that feeling is just a feeling, and actually what we do is based on these two factors, genes and up-to-date conditioning, which we're not in control of. And we see that when we make a choice, the outcome of that choice also not in our control. Sometimes we get what we want and sometimes we don't get what we want. And so what is Roger? Roger is this combination of impersonal consciousness, the body, and the experience, the feeling of being Rogerness, functioning in daily life. And so with this understanding, knowing that Roger isn't the ultimate doer, knowing that everyone else is the same, an instrument through which consciousness functions, an instrument doing what they feel like doing, but actually those actions are part of the destined story of life. That means that Roger remains continuously aware of his connection to Source, because the idea that I am a doer and I am a separate independent entity and not connected to anything has fallen away. And so the realization that whatever happens through Roger in any moment, whatever happens through anyone in any moment, speaking can only happen if Source is connected to the body. So with that, whenever there's any movement, there's the understanding, the knowing, the being connected to Source. And it's from that realization of our connection to Source that continuous unbroken peace of mind persists in daily living regardless of the circumstance we find ourselves in, regardless of whether life delivers pleasure or pain. And it's from that place of understanding that what I really am is the consciousness of Source that we can then start to relate to the flow of life as something that I don't need to judge, that I don't need to discriminate against on the level of who I am. So from that point of view, I see good and bad as valid aspects of the flow of life, still knowing that bad on a biological level is going to create pain. So what I call bad is there is good and bad relative to certain benchmarks. So we can say that that is bad relative to social etiquette benchmarks. And we can say that that is painful relative to my biological preferences. But as long as I'm no longer identified with being the body alone, then the pain can be there. And we can say that that is pain. We don't say, well, I don't see pleasure and pain anymore. It's all good, or it just is. So that It just is. It just is, I agree. But what
Like some of my friends go to the dentist and they don't use Novocaine or anything.
That's craziness, but it could be a fun experience, yeah, or not a fun experience. It can be. They're obviously getting something out of it, right? What are they getting out of it? A sense of being tough? I don't know.
Well, they are hanging out with pain in a different way than I hang out with pain.
Mm-hmm.
I like Novocaine. So in what you're saying, it's all just preferences.
The flow of life is based on our biological preferences. There's no way that pain is not going to be pain. Your attitude to pain is significant, because when we have an attitude of attachment to pain, then the pain is significantly intensive. Well, so the pain the experience is significantly intensified. The pain is there, but there's an intensification of resistance to the pain when we're attached to pleasure and pain. When we're not attached to pleasure and pain is still going to be pain, but the attachment to it has dropped away, so the intensity of the experience will drop away. And so it's great. Ramesh had a story, and I can see that one time when he was in hospital after an operation, he could feel this pain, and the nurse said, "Let me give you some painkillers." And he said, "Actually, just hold off for a while." And he said he felt the pain building and building and building as pain. And the reason he said hold off for a while was he wanted to investigate the relationship to pain. And he found that with this attitude of accepting pain as part of the flow of life, there was a significantly more acceptable experience. He said very much pain was there. It's not that pain wasn't there. And when it got to a certain plateau, he called the nurse over and he said, "Okay, now you can give me the painkillers." Now that's sensible. That's an investigation that allows us to understand what pain is in the flow of life and what pleasure is, to see that we can have two attitudes to the flow of life, an attitude of attachment or an attitude of understanding that the flow of life is going to be pleasure and pain, and that attitude is significantly relevant to our happiness. So once he saw that, then now you can take you can take the pain away. He knew, though, he could get given the painkillers and the pain could persist because the outcome not in his control. And so if he got given the painkillers and the pain persisted, he would have to accept he's done what he can in order to mitigate the pain and the outcome not in his control. In this case, he did what he could and the pain vanished, and so that was a much more pleasant situation. So acceptance of the flow of life doesn't mean not biologically acting in a way that you think is best to try and fix the situation or make the situation more pleasurable, but most importantly knowing that the outcome not in your control. So if what you do doesn't fix the situation, then you still have the right to try something else. If that doesn't fix the situation, you have the right to try something else. But at some point we might say, I've tried everything I can, and I just have to accept that pain is part of the moment. And whether suffering is there or not depends on whether we can see it that way.
I'm just wondering if some of the confusion happened from states.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you're talking right now, you're kind of talking from a more integrated place. And I imagine there's been times where there's been lots of different states.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess those kind of absolute states will just come and go. And
So, okay, I've said this a few times, but all of these things are worth repeating because we tend to have these false beliefs.
mm-hmm.
And so states, in my experience, I was convinced after having read non-dual teachings for a long time and started to have shifts in states, that what eventually would happen is one would find oneself in a very impersonal experience of oneness. That's what the esoteric non-dual teachings tend to suggest, or at least that's how I interpreted it, and I can see a lot of people interpret it that way.
Especially if they're having a lot of those.
That's right, and they tend to, the process tends to bring about these states in order for us to see stuff that is not normally seen, to reveal. So the power of spiritual experience is not to have a great experience or a profound experience, but to be shown something that is not normally seen. So something that's in the background comes into the forefront, or a whole lot of things in the background come into the forefront in order for us to realize, oh, wow, what I thought was what I thought was reality, or the only, is not the only, because it changes. The fact is it changes back, which means what we experience as a state is not reality either. And some states feel like, oh, I've shifted out of experience into reality. Mm-hmm. They're designed to feel like that. And it's a big mistake. There's no reality. There's only experience in life. We can have oneness experiences that feel very profound, and the conclusion is, oh, this is reality. This is the non-dual that is being spoken about. Because some of those experiences can be hugely profound experiences of oneness, where subject-object relationship falls away, where where what I am as formless awareness presents itself experientially. And so in my experience, I had one of those such states that demonstrated everything that was written in I Am That, Nisargadatta's teaching, down to the T. It also happened at the time I was reading those things. It's not accidental that it happens at the same time. And then, exactly as you say, it happens, and so we become convinced that what is being spoken about is available as a state, because the state happens. And then when the state falls away, the conclusion is, it fell away, but at some point it will come back, and it will stay indefinitely. And witnessing is different to that full-blown, profound experience of oneness. Witnessing is a much more subtle version, still an experience or a state that shows everything arises inside formless awareness, but nonetheless a state, and even witnessing is not something that is meant to persist. And so I got on the plane, went to see Ramesh and said, listen, this is what happened. And I explained it in a lot of detail, great detail. It's hard to explain these things that are pretty profound, but I was pretty good, I think, in my first attempt. And he said, Roger, don't worry about it. It was just an experience. No, he didn't understand, obviously. This was not just an experience. So I explained it again, rejigging some things, just in case I missed some things. And then he said, Roger, don't worry about it. It was just an experience. And one last effort, if I didn't really know what else I could add, because I'd done a pretty good job explaining it. Roger, don't worry, that was just an experience. And all truth be known, it wasn't just an experience in that it revealed, in hindsight, I see what it revealed. But my relationship to it wasn't so much about what it revealed, but assuming that was the oneness that is spoken about. And for months, I didn't really believe what he said, because I was relating to it, and the experience of it was so profound, and it was so much. It was oneness. It was everything that is spoken about in the falling away of the small self, the revelation of the self with a capital S. There was this thought at the time that if someone came and hacked my arms off with a machete, they wouldn't even be slightly touching what I am. And some other things. Strangely enough, my hands went over my eyes, and I realized, wow, this is interesting. Although it seems like everything is being recognized, awareness is the container. Still, when the hands went over the eyes, the imagery changed. So there was this added benefit that said, the body is a significant object in this experience that to me was just looking like experience. So it felt like it was being recognized not from the perspective of the body, because the center of consciousness was not located in the body. And yet, for some reason, my hands went up and covered, which afterwards became a very important component that remained with me, because it started to demonstrate what role the body actually plays. So anyway, for months I didn't believe what Ramesh said, and I was waiting for this state to come back again, walking the same route in the morning where it happened, and just waiting as I get to that tree. Is it going to happen again? And then it became obvious that this waiting, this expectation, was starting to become suffering. Because I had the terminology that was able to highlight what suffering was. Plus I could feel it. You know, I now was very, very sensitive to what suffering was. And it was at that point that it dawned on me, I said, what if he's right? Because up to that point, from the time he said it up to that point, did not even one slightest bit of space that considered he might be right. Until awareness landed on the fact that I'm waiting for something to happen again. And it was my suffering. And then I realized, what if he's right? If he's right, my belief about this being it is wrong. And then suddenly a whole lot of things swept in. What we're really looking for in life is happiness for the human being. Happiness for the human being is continuous, unbroken peace of mind. Peace of mind is the end of suffering. Buddha said it, enlightenment is the end of suffering. The cause of suffering is desire. And then this definition came in, I go, well, what if peace of mind, the end of suffering, is available not in a oneness state, which I knew was the case. And I thought, so in that case, I don't need the oneness state. That's not the solution. I'm just after happiness. I can have happiness as this then, if the beliefs fall away. And then I saw this expectation for a state was just another belief about what I needed in the future, and what enlightenment was. And these things fall away. Something that can persist for 60 years can fall away in an instant, once awareness and the intellect land on these things. This is why, to me, these concepts, which at first sound very intellectual, and all insight is a process that starts off with intellectual understanding. And it's only when the intellectual understanding goes deeper and deeper through an investigation of what the concepts are saying for yourself based on your own personal experience. Once the intellectual concepts go deeper and deeper, at some point it shifts into a realization, an insight which is not intellectual. But that shift doesn't happen until the intellect dissolves itself effectively. Dissolves what is in the way.
So in your case, there was then this realization that this was causing suffering, and that there's this individual to be lived through Roger who was having a personal experience. Do you think it's true that there are some masters or some who do experience this oneness as their natural state, in the same way some people have, a lot of sensitivity to subtle energy or extra sensory types of things, or there's so much diversity? Is it possible that that's just through the human body, that the only experience of ego would just be perhaps enough to recognize when their name is called, or that there's some form, but that might be an ongoing state or a way of living?
I don't discount the fact that that can be the case. So definitely different masters will have different energetic expressions, and often those different energetic expressions are there to attract people, so that the person basically has a reason to hang around, and the concepts, the energy to. No teacher has ever uttered anything that isn't a concept. Doesn't matter how profound the concept sounds or what the content of the concept. It's still a concept. And sure, there's an energetic component to all of that, but the point is that the words are always conceptual, pointing at something that is beyond the intellect. And certain teachers have different flavors. Some are much more bhakti-oriented, some more peace-oriented, and their energetic field is different in order to serve in their role as a teacher. And that energetic field that comes outward can often be affected by the practices that, or the way they spend their life. So if someone is meditating a lot, then that oneness state, in meditation, the person tends to fall away. Even the sense of being the individual falls away in meditation. But when it comes to ordinary functioning in daily living, we're not in a state of meditation. So, like, take Ramana, for example. If he was in an ashram, he was a teacher in an ashram, everything, he was looked after, and he meditated a lot. And when he was not meditating, the Ramananess, the identification with name and form, the sense of the individual, in my estimation, is not a problem, and it would be there. And yes, he said that the ego of a sage, so he didn't say that a sage doesn't have an ego. An ego in this sense is not the problem. It's the sense of personal doership attached to the ego that is the problem. So he said the ego of a sage is like the remnants of a burnt rope, meaning it's there, but when you try to grab it, it's got no form. And that's what's been realized by the sage themselves, that what I am, even though it feels like there is a Ramana here, actually has no form to it. And so whether they're in a state of oneness or not is largely irrelevant, because what we're looking for in daily living, peace in daily living, is available outside of a oneness experience. So the oneness becomes, in a sense, just a flavor if they're in a state of oneness. But you know, the thing is that because those teachings are awakening teachings, they focus on the oneness. They have to. They're there to crack something. So they don't present a lot of. They're not necessarily that well rounded intentionally to be powerful at what they do. When you look at Ramana's behavior as it's documented, there are, you know, he had asthma or something and had to take a lot of pills, and he didn't like it, and so his attendant would give him pills, and he'd snap at the attendant sometimes, and so that's the humanness, and there's no problem with that, because he was snapping. Snapping was a biological reaction that he didn't get involved with, so there was no suffering. And then you look at a sage like Nisargadatta Maharaj, whose experience is described, or the whole teaching is about oneness, and he was very much, saying, "I am not this. I am the awareness, the consciousness. You keep saying that I am this, but you're just projecting your idea of yourself onto me." So he would say that, but actually the behavior, and I suspect, I don't know the experience, but I know what the shift is. And the shift is not a shift where the sense of the individual falls away. The sense of the individual remains, but it's seen clearly that it's not something that is absolute, not something that's real. It's just an experience, part of the experience. So that the state, whatever the state is to me, is incidental. What's important is for us to realize I don't need oneness as a state in order to be happy. Especially if we are hanging on to remaining in witnessing, because each time we come out of that, it feels like, what was happening is now not happening, because I come back out of that. And so if we look at Ramana's teachings closely, there is an explanation of Sanskrit term, aham sfurana, the bursting forth of I am, which he makes very clear that is not enlightenment. And it's so that when the awareness realizes the sense of existence, the I amness, for a period of time, the I amness is center stage, where there's a very clear awareness of the core of the human being. And in a similar way to awareness recognizing the awareness aspect, where it feels very expansive and very clearly that everything is arising in the container, he says this too falls away. Means what was there as an experience falls away. And that's not a problem. It's a problem if we think that that was enlightenment and then it falls away. Then we're going to think my enlightenment has fallen away. He's saying it's meant to fall away. It's just there to show you something, to show you that there is this I amness that is the core of the human being. And then once it's been there long enough, it falls away, and then we can live as the human, connected to, with an awareness of the I amness, but functioning through the body.
I have another question. Is there time though? I don't know.
We're just on the edge, so and anyone who needs to leave, feel free to leave, and we'll take that as the last question.
Earlier when she was asking, or you were talking about the reconditioning process, and she'd suggested that, you can feel the feelings and not go into the story and be in this acceptance. And you said that's part of it, but there's first the conceptual, the mind conditioning, and then that these are deeply held beliefs that when they're released, there's energy there that shows up in the form of emotions. I don't know if I'm articulating it exactly how you did.
Yeah, more.
But
Yeah.
then you said I'll explain the mechanics of it. And I remember I was listening to, I think Rupert Spira or something was talking about kind of two approaches, and one is self-inquiry when suffering arises, who is this happening to? But the other is this tantric approach, which is really diving into the feeling and really being with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then later you were mentioning that there were two sort of approaches, either looking at doership and recognizing that we're not the doer, or allowing everything to be as it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess my question is, are those equally valid, the non-doership or the allowing everything to be as it is, which I would put in the category of this more tantric approach,
Mm-hmm.
and the doership with more the inquiry? And they're valid, or is one dependent on the other?
So I don't doership and allowing everything to be as it is, to me is one thing. They're not opposites. But where the question is fantastic is that when we find ourselves exposed to non-dual teachings and just witnessing as the main instruction, there's this very important aspect where we start to see that emotion dissolves when it's just witnessed for what it is. Just witnessed as emotion, it tends to dissolve. And that's very important to show us that the nature of emotion is sort of doesn't actually exist. It's not a solid thing. It dissolves. But we can often start to think that that's the solution, is to just witness and have everything dissolve all the time. And then what we find in that process is we're going out into daily life. Life impacts us, and we get drawn into the emotion, and then we feel like, oh no, my job is to witness it so that it dissolves. And I think it's very important to hear this, which is at a certain point in time, your job isn't to witness anymore, especially if you find yourself getting dragged out of the witness because life is triggering things. Your job now is to feel. Put all of the witnessing and the ideas of the end of suffering out of the window, just for a while, put them on the back burner, and drop into feeling. And sometimes someone goes, really? Is this non-duality? Because non-duality sometimes doesn't talk much about feeling, it talks about witnessing. And to really feel is to really allow the feeling to explode, to really flower. And sometimes witnessing doesn't exist in that as a complementary to that. And that's when we start to see the stories at the bottom of the emotions that are stored away, by really saying, okay, I'm not going to witness anymore, that I'm just going to go in and feel and allow the emotions to flower. And as they flower, we can start to see what the storyline at the bottom is, much more than we ever have. We might not realize that we hated that person as deeply as the emotion is clearly showing us. And we need to be able to access these deeper levels of the belief systems, that, wow, I hate that person in that intensity. And the storyline is always going to fall in line with the concepts put forward. Sense of personal doership and attachment to outcome. So I hate you because of what you did to me, and what you did to me was an attack on my happiness. And if we don't feel these emotions, then that layer of belief remains suppressed. So it's a combination of witnessing and coming in and really feeling the hatred and anger. And that combination can be very powerful. And at some point, what I found is that we can feel these feelings and witnessing happens simultaneously. And that's when, once again, the process of release becomes very efficient. Because clearly when witnessing is happening while these intense emotions are being felt, means that on a conscious level, we're no longer attached in the same way we were when the event happened. And so then the story can be seen as a story that I no longer believe as a way of relating to life anymore. And that's when the emotion can come out and be released. So very much valid, both sides. Not only valid, but they're complementaries, and they should work together. And we don't need to do that. As long as the belief falls away that says, I just need to remain out there in the witnessing, as long as that belief falls away, then the process continues to unfold quite naturally.